This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Friday's program, we start, as always, with our grain market update from grain market economist here at K-State, Dan O'Brien. He explains the response in the futures markets as a result of hope for precipitation this fall and the potential for exporting of grain out of Ukraine. Also ahead, the 2022 wheat variety guide is broken down by K-State wheat and forage specialist Romulo Lollato and wheat pathology specialist Kelsey Anderson Onofre. We end with this week's agricultural weather report, which is provided by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. He shares information on the precipitation received in all four corners of the state this past week, as well as a review of the outlooks for September that were recently released. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Dan O'Brien. He is our K-State grain market economist, and he is going to cover, as he always does, our weekly grain market update. So, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha.
Got lots to cover here today, so let's go ahead and get into things, starting with our cash markets. I know that corn and soybeans are really holding fairly strong, but wheat has dropped off.
Yes, it has. We're seeing cash wheat bids, especially in the last day or so, having declined. I think in the overall futures scope of things, some moisture coming into parts of the U.S., that would help in the soil profile. That would be needed to help get winter wheat established. Again, looking for moisture to be available September, October. So that was responded to, the promise of rain coming in. And also with the success in getting more wheat out of Ukraine through the agreed upon shipment mechanisms that the UN and Turkey were involved in. I think the market sees that information and responds with the idea that, well, there's less pressure on tightness of supplies. I think that might be in question some. I still think the world situation is so tight that, yeah, we'll welcome any of that wheat coming out of there for humanitarian purposes. But you still have ongoing drought in the European Union and problems elsewhere. I think a quiet issue that's not being talked about so much is that Russia has a large crop projected to get a lot of wheat out of their country. But I understand from ag market analysis, the world's ability to actually get wheat out of Russia has slowed down, and probably sanctions, other issues all in play. So the drop that we'd seen in the wheat markets yesterday, September contract down 38 cents. Yes, I can see why we might rationalize that, but boy, there's a long way to go before you declare that suddenly we're not going to have strength in the wheat markets. Cash prices, again, this is all be post-harvest now for our hard red winter wheat crops, still holding up pretty decently. Colby at 763, Salina, more of our export center, 797. 797 also in Hutchinson. Those are the two highs in the state. And again, more central part, basis levels strong, really, 16 under. And a lot of times for wheat, when we're not in the middle of a massive panic run-up, we're at 40, 50 cents. Well, here, even at this time, we're 16 under, and that's indicating some strength. Topeka, 788, Columbus, 738, even Colby and Garden City are in the act with about 45, 50 cent under prices. So interesting to look at. As we talked about, cash markets, still strong basis patterns, local demand for corn. You look at Garden City at 730, and actually Colby has a top bid of 740 over Garden City. Rare air for Colby. Garden City is such a strong area. Columbus at 720, so you're all looking at $1 to $1.10 to $1.20 over. So that just continues. We hear a lot of discussion, Samantha, amongst in the countryside of livestock feeders, ethanol users, people from out of state offering tremendous forward price bids for corn in anticipation of where we're at. There are worries about the availability of having enough trains to actually pull grain out of the central corn belt over here into western Kansas. So to me, you kind of bring all that together, and I know you have to balance what you actually see with what you hear might happen. But we're already at $1 to $1.20 over in some of these areas, and indicative of, I wouldn't say panicked buying, but very, very aggressive buying. People with businesses on the line, cattle and feedlots, ethanol plants they want to run, that are worried about having supplies. So, gee whiz, you look at that, we're at $1 to $1.20 over. It used to be that for a good number of years, we watched the Hereford, Texas bid as the leading regional bid for corn in this part of the world, and they were 40, 60 cents over, with the idea that they that bid rewarded corn grown locally, but it was pulling, that was a train bid. They were pulling grain out of the Eastern Corn Belt to come to Hereford, Texas. Wow. Well, now where we're at, these Southwest Kansas bids, and all of Western Kansas bids, and Southeast too, we're operating in the same mode. We're really in a massive demand pull mode to try to get corn in. So I know what the futures are doing, but in Kansas, we're seeing such strong demand that our basis levels are just stacking on top of whatever strength we get in the corn futures.
When we were talking beforehand, you mentioned an unusual weakness in one of our current areas, and that's in Topeka. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Topeka, eastern Kansas, they've had some rains. I've driven through there of late, and they're probably not as worried in terms of supplies. You have an ethanol plant to the south of there in Garnett. You've got some other things going on, but still they have a pretty good corn bid at 87 over at 707. When you look at forward bid for harvest, there at least the highest bid I could find in that area is about 586. That's about a 60 to 80 cents lower for a new crop forward contract bid than other areas of the state. So they're not apparently as worried about securing supplies in a forward manner as these other parts of the country are. Grain sorghum bids, you've got positive basis for Colby area, 25 over, even money in Salina, even in Garden, 7 over in Hutchinson, 50 over in Columbus. So grain sorghum bids aren't as strong as for corn, but they're still pretty strong in most areas. Again, in Topeka, they're about 18 under, so that's still historically a great bid, but not as much of a strenuous demand pull as in other parts of the state. I should mention soybeans, since we also paid quite a bit of attention to that. A lot of variation across the state. You do see the two western Kansas areas with wider soybean basis bids. We don't have as much soybeans out here, but Colby and Garden City at about $1 under. But you start heading into Salina and especially Hutchinson, and mostly in Columbus, you're getting from 10 under to 20 over. Columbus is 20 over for soybeans. So you've got some real issues happening there in that local market. I stand back and look at the markets and the trends and try to see where our momentum is at this stage. In the materials we have on Ag Manager, we have some weekly continuous futures charts that we're watching. And on a scale of 0 being very, very weak and bearish markets to 100 being outstandingly bullish and strong markets, 50% being right in the middle, just neutral, going sideways. Corn futures right now, on that type of scale, they have a rating of about 43, so they're neutral. Chicago wheat has a rating on that of about 38, a little bit weaker than corn, 38, 39. Soybeans coming in at about 43, so soybeans, corn at about the same. So we're just in a mode coming off the highs we had, about a month ago, to where we're just sort of sideways to going lower. I think going forward, we will have new sets of USDA numbers to have to wrestle with. We still have a major unanswered question with dryness now that's emerging in Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, with the U.S. drought monitor showing dry soils, a lot of drawdown in soil profile moisture, and the need to keep bringing timely rains every week to overcome what we don't have in the rest of the soil profile, but yet we can't still survive through if we keep getting just nursed along in terms of rainfall. So you've got areas that are on the precipice of really seeing declines in their yields. And we already know that's happening in the central and southern plains, but it sure bears watching in terms of what's happening up in, as we said, Iowa, southern Minnesota, and the Dakotas. They have the potential, if they don't get bailed out by timely rains, to really start to see some yield declines.
Absolutely. Yet another, reaffirming of the fact that we'll find a bit more stability in September when we know a little bit more what we're dealing with here. But more to come on that for sure.
And I think that stability would come from sure knowledge. Yes, the amount of uncertainty we'd hope would go away. Yes. And we'd be able to plan more readily. But right now we've had those August numbers, a lot of uncertainty around them, as you and I have just been talking about. And I think we'll have a clearer picture where we really are coming in at once we get to September and then October and November. But at this time, we're just trying to figure how this situation is going to work out for the rest of the summer.
In terms of weather, we've been talking about weather. It's the common theme, the drought that's going on. we've got some distinctive weather patterns that are appearing in the Corn Belt specifically, which is, of course, of major concern. Because not only is that impacting our grain markets, but it's also going to affect our cattle markets as well. So we're not looking optimistic here in that realm of things, are we?
I think that Glenn Tonser, our friend and colleague, could talk quite a bit about the impact we've already had on cow herd and what that will bring about, what's almost forcing to happen in coming months in terms of livestock numbers for placement in feedlots, what in terms of meat markets, what type of impact that will have on feed demand, probably be lower in some of these areas. So we've got some real dynamic and challenging, i.e. troubling things happening. I hear good discussion, no doubt you too, and talking with people about just the availability of hay in some of these areas. Just really sought after and tough markets. So I think for us, we've been so affected by this Western Corn Belt event. Again, the ongoing La Nina weather pattern that we've had. We have had some discussion from climatologists who've indicated that we could be in line for a third year of La Nina. And it's not unprecedented, but as you start to string these together, you're starting to look more like the 1930s than a regular in and out pattern. So we hope that doesn't happen. But until that weather pattern actually solves itself and goes away, there is that risk, and that adds questions for us for cropping plans and really our financial plans heading off into 2023.
Absolutely. And we'll hopefully here soon in the future have more on the similarities that we're seeing today compared to, like you mentioned, the 1930s with our meteorologist, Chip Redmond, and our assistant climatologist, Matt Siddle. So listeners, stay tuned for that because I'm sure that'll be an insightful conversation for sure. But Dan, as always, thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Take care.
Once again, that was Dan O'Brien. He is our grain market economist here at K-State, covering this week's grain market report. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with two guests. We have with us Romulo Lollato. He is a wheat and forage specialist here at K-State. And Kelsey Anderson Onofre. She's a wheat pathology specialist. So today we're going to be covering the 2022 Wheat Variety Guide, which was formerly known in the past as the Wheat Variety Disease and Insects Ratings. Tell us a little bit about this document.
About 7 years ago, it was a document only reporting on insects and diseases in terms of how varieties are either resistant or not to those, right? So what's the typical variety reaction to those insects and diseases? For about 7 years now, I have updated it to add some agronomics as well, right? So other things that growers are interested in knowing in terms of what's the maturity of those varieties, how do they react, for example, to lodging conditions or height and things along these lines. So it's really a document that tends to give growers more information about commercially available wheat varieties in the state of Kansas.
This document really is a comprehensive guide. So we have a lot of varieties in here that are new, maybe just released within the last couple of years, but also some historical varieties, right? So that can give some perspective if you want to compare, say, a variety you've grown for a long time with one of the newer varieties. You can definitely do that.
Absolutely. And when we think about some of what goes into the ratings of some of this information that you just mentioned, what does that process really look like on your guys' side of things?
Yeah, so that's something that maybe everyone doesn't realize, that this is actually a lot of data that's collected across the state of Kansas over multiple years. So through the season, we're out looking at a lot of demo plots and also research plots that we've planted, disease nurseries, either that we've put together here at K-State or that we've worked with our partners at the USDA for. And we take multi-year data to really summarize how this variety is going to react to certain diseases or under certain agronomic conditions under a typical scenario, right? So you can find, for example, how your variety will hold up against leaf rust, against stripe rust, against some of our leaf spotting diseases, and some of our important viruses. And there's also a lot of agronomic information. So I have Romulo here. He can talk more about that. But it really paints a picture of what a variety looks like. So if I was going to go through this document, first thing that I might do is look at some of the initial information, and then you find variety profiles. So this is, if you've honed in on one or two varieties and you want to see some commentary about them, maybe you're interested in their pedigree, some of their strengths and weaknesses, you can see all the information about that specific variety in those profiles. But I think what a lot of folks do is pan to the back and look at the appendices. So these are tables where you have all of the varieties and all of their disease reactions or agronomic reactions, and you can kind of go across the list. So say I need something that has resistance to wheat streak mosaic virus, right? That was a big problem for our producers in central Kansas this year. Well, I can go in and I can kind of key out some varieties that might work well and then look at their agronomics, right? So that might be one way I would use this tool, and I know some producers do use it that way.
Absolutely. So the agronomics being the new addition to this document, right? So what all does that side of things really include?
Yeah, so whenever we are taking these notes, and as Kelsey mentioned, right, there's a lot of data behind whenever we release a given note here. Essentially, they go all from 1 through 9, right? Usually 1 being the best that it can be for that trait and 9 being the worst. Or in case of something that doesn't really have a best or worst, like maturity, for example, 1 being the earliest and 9 being the latest. But these are opportunistic notes, right? So many times we go to a trial and say, oh, well, here we can actually see drought tolerance, and so we'll take notes on drought tolerance. A different trial may be lodged, right? Because it's irrigated and there's a lot of fertility, and so we take lodging notes. And similar things with disease resistances, and so very opportunistic. Now, although they are opportunistic, Kelsey mentioned this is coming from several locations across several years. We usually try not to release a note there unless we've seen that variety a number of times. I don't have a minimal number of my head, but probably if I've seen it at least 10 or 12 times, I might release that note if it really aligns well with our feeling for that variety. Otherwise, we want to see it more times before releasing really a note of the variety. So really a lot of data going behind there to help growers make this decision. Variety selection is among the most important decisions that a grower can make, and nowadays they have over 50 options that they can choose from. So really many, many options out there. And our goal with this guide is just to try and make it a little bit easier, right? Once growers look at yield data in their region and see how, in terms of agronomics, how it's performing yield-wise. Okay, well, I've selected 10 varieties here that are performing very well, but I don't want to plant 10 varieties, right? So now they can zoom in each one of these and see if they are a good fit for that region or not. For example, this last season, we were extremely dry throughout the entire state for most of the wheat growing season, exception of southeast Kansas, right? So varieties with very good drought tolerance yielded extremely well. And that includes many varieties that were bred by Colorado State University for western Kansas, yielding well in central Kansas. Well, are those really varieties that growers in central Kansas should plant? In a normal year, probably not, right? They're probably more susceptible to stem rust or stripe rust or some diseases that they should not plant in central Kansas, even though those varieties may do well in 1 year because of those conditions, right? So that's where this guide come in, right? Now that they reduce the number of varieties that they want to select from based on yield performance in their region. Now they go into those few varieties and they look, okay, well, what are some of the agronomic characteristics that I want? And that depends on your cropping system, right? If you're planting wheat after corn, there's a number of things that you want to be looking at, and that really reduces the varieties that you have in terms of options to plant. And that's, again, type of information that we are providing here that growers can benefit from once they have nailed down some of those varieties that they're interested in.
You mentioned that some new varieties have been added. So what are those new varieties that were included this year?
Yeah, so some of the new varieties, we included a few, included KS Ahern, so that's a Kansas Wheat Alliance variety, and KS Hamilton. And also we have a profile now for LCS Revere, so that's just a little more information on that variety. We also updated some ratings on some of the varieties, so that might seem strange. Why would we update a rating on a variety that's maybe been grown for multiple years? And that's because sometimes these ratings change. A great example of a reason why a rating would change would be stripe rust. So at least over the last decade, we've had changes in our populations of stripe rust. So varieties, for example, like Monument. Monument is arguably maybe the most popular variety in Kansas, or has been in the last several years. But one really important thing that happened is that Monument, which was more resistant to stripe rust, is now more susceptible because of these new races, right? And so that's something that's reflected in this document. So we went through, and after multiple years where we had ratings that were rating a little higher than what we had originally documented for Monument, we actually downgraded its resistance. So we do that every year when we have new data supporting the need to do that. So that is, a good recommendation or a good strategy. You really want to make sure, even if you have a variety that, say, you really liked or you've liked for the last several years, it's always important to take a look at this document and just double check some of the disease ratings, because that might influence your need for that fungicide, or at least keep in the back of your mind that you might need that fungicide application coming into this season. So that's something that, even if we didn't add a variety, we have updated a few varieties here. Now, there might be varieties that are new out there. We can probably think of a couple that are not included. And that's for that reason that Romulo just mentioned. We just don't feel like we've had enough K-State observations for those varieties. And specifically this year, we just didn't get enough views of some of the rust diseases. So we just don't have enough data to say ourselves how those varieties perform. So we'll probably see those within the next couple of years come through in this document.
You mentioned a lot of changes that are possible, but are there any major changes in addition to what you just discussed that producers should be aware of when they're looking into the guide this year?
I believe that this year specifically, we didn't have any major changes, mostly because of the reason that Kelsey mentioned, right? It was so dry, and we really didn't have the opportunity to observe those new races, for example, or even any disease at all. And so I believe that most of the major changes that occur from one year to another will be more related to diseases and disease rating of these varieties. In agronomics, they tend to be more stable, although we might come across a variety that, is not as drought tolerant as we initially believed, or doesn't have as strong of a straw as we believed that it had. And so in the agronomic ratings, they tend not to be as drastic as we may see every now and then for disease ratings.
Absolutely. Well, definitely things for producers to keep in mind. They're interested in reading through it themselves. Where can they actually find the 2022 wheat variety guide this year?
Probably if you want to go to this absolute source, you can go to the KSRE bookstore. So that's bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu/pubs/mf991.pdf, right? So that's a pretty long URL. So if you don't have that, a pen to write that down, that's fine. We've put it in a lot of places. So we put it in the agronomy updates very recently, so you can check out a recent issue or last week's issue of that. We also tweet about it, so I know we've put it on our Twitter pages and social media, so I think we'll link it in the notes about this show here. So I think hopefully you can find the link, or you can reach out to Romulo or myself or your local extension agent, and they would be, I'm sure, happy to send you the link so you can get a copy of this.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned, it will for sure be in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. But otherwise, thank you both so much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Romulo Lollato. He is a wheat and forage specialist here at K-State. And Kelsey Anderson Onofre. She's a wheat pathology specialist. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are closing today's programming with our agricultural weather report, which, as always, is covered by Chip Redmond. He is our K-State meteorologist. So, Chip, thanks for joining us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So this week we had some precipitation across the state, and from what we were talking about before we went on air here, it looks like it covered all four corners of the state almost.
Yeah, we literally had good moisture in every corner of the state. Unfortunately, it did not get very far into the state. Up to an inch was received in every corner, and then central Kansas, really, there was no moisture at all, which led to, increasing deficits in the central part of the state, and then some minor improvements moisture-wise in each corner. And a lot of that fell pretty heavily, so we saw more runoff in those areas. We didn't see any flooding, but those soils in each of those areas was very, very dry. It takes a lot more long-term moisture to have big impacts instead of really only a couple hours of heavy rain, which was what was received. Other areas developed up to an inch or more deficit over the last 7 days where they did not see rain.
Sure, so definitely some changes in the drought monitor as a result of this past week, right?
Yeah, we saw expansion in pretty much every category. D0 moved northward to I-70. Probably the more notable changes were extreme and exceptional drought continues to slowly expand eastward and northward into central Kansas.
Sure. So this top corner of the state where we are in Manhattan, is it still kind of holding on? I know for a while there it wasn't really showing anything on the drought monitor. Can we expect for that to continue?
Yeah, the Manhattan bubble was about to be burst here. We were going to try to include them in D0 this week in abnormally dry conditions. However, that rain really helped offset the deficits marginally enough to prevent D0 addition this week and kind of ward it off for another week. We'll see how long that lasts based on the conditions. But other than that, really the northeast corner is really the only area where we do not have either abnormally dry or severe or worse drought.
And then looking into the weeks ahead, do we have anything on the radar showing any hope, or are we kind of expecting still some slight to no rain chances here?
Yeah, we were really optimistic about rain chances, especially for the southern half of the state a week ago. But that's unfortunately continued to trend further south. And really, the Oklahoma-Kansas border is going to be a pretty big barrier, at least at this time, for the next rain event, which will be late weekend to early next week, where south of Kansas, they expect 5 to 7 inches of rainfall over about 3 to 4 day period. Unfortunately, that's all going to stay to our south. It looks pretty darn dry for most of Kansas. Some light precipitation occurred overnight Thursday into Friday morning, only in scattered, isolated areas. Beyond that, we have had a pattern breakdown, which is why we see cooler temperatures and some precipitation chances. We expect that pattern to try to build back in following basically getting into mid to late next week. However, forecast models are kind of all over the board with it, which leaves me a little optimistic that we might still see some moisture chances continue into early September, just because we're not seeing the ridge of high pressure, or heat dome, as a lot of folks call it, build back into the capacity it was before.
Absolutely, yeah. The relief of the heat in the week ahead is something I'm personally really looking forward to. But I know you recently mentioned that outlooks for September were released. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the new outlooks came out on Thursday morning. Unfortunately, the trend of warmer than normal and drier than normal conditions continues through the month of September from the Climate Prediction Center. That theme persists to really the end of the year. They're really weighing a lot on La Nina, persistent again for a third winter now. We won't exactly see the extreme conditions that we saw last year in the fall, but we definitely have the playing board is laid out very similarly as you saw going into last year. So the warmer, drier theme is likely to continue. Definitely a concern for folks looking to plant wheat, and then any folks who are lucky enough to get harvest in, hopefully some good harvest conditions.
Absolutely. Well, Chip, as always, we thank you so much for your time and for this report.
Yep, thanks for having me. Talk to you next week.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Chip Redmond. He is our meteorologist here at K-State, covering this week's agricultural weather report. That concludes this week's programming. We'll be back with more on Monday for Agriculture Today.